My name is Kevin Martin, and I'm coming to you from the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program. This is our weekly update. We're a little late this week, but we are starting to get busy with harvest. And while this doesn't immediately relate to harvest, we've got some of that stuff coming up in some podcasts as we really do get rolling with the Concords. I did want to touch on changes in labor. And the reason I wanted to do that is because there's been some data coming out of a couple of different sources. And what I really wanted to touch on, what interested me the most, is all this stuff has been happening in New York State. We've seen changes in minimum wage. We've seen changes in overtime pay. We've seen changes in training requirements like sexual harassment training. And all of this stuff is going to hit our New York State farmers and the laborers on those farms, or has already. Pennsylvania is a very different story. There hasn't been too much that has changed. There's been a couple of federal changes, but it's really been over the last decade. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, no paid family leave or anything like that. So the New York Fed did a study along border counties. They looked at retail trade and they looked at employment and leisure hospitality. So two fairly low paid industries. They didn't look at agriculture. We just don't employ enough people for anybody to really bother studying it that closely. But we compete with those industries for our labor supply indirectly. So to me, it was pretty interesting. And what it showed is along these border counties, which have pretty similar economies across state lines. So New York State's pretty similar in those rural areas to Pennsylvania. It showed that wages are rising in New York State, which everybody would expect because they have to rise because minimum wage rose. They are not rising in Pennsylvania. So the Pennsylvania economy, for the most part, on average, is not competing with this New York State minimum wage. They are able to recruit local labor. I don't know if that's necessarily at a satisfactory quantity, but we're not seeing a response in price to try to get more. The other thing that's happening on the New York side is we are not seeing a drop down in the number of people employed either. So it's somewhat interesting that we're seeing that. You know, I think the fear with rising minimum wage is always that firms or employers will react and lay people off to try to compensate for the higher price. We are not seeing that yet. I think the study's rather incomplete, and I think they'll continue to do it because we do need to see it as minimum wage continues to go up, and we also need to see it as we go through a bit of a change in the economy. So since this minimum wage plan has rolled out, we've seen low unemployment levels. We've seen high growth in most of these sectors other than a little bit of a pause in retail, but that's been recent. So we want to see what happens here as minimum wage continues to go up, and then we see an economic slump whenever we see one. Not that I'm rooting for one, but you know, it is always a matter of time. These things move in cycles, so we'd like to see that as we move through a cycle. And what you might see if this continues, on the other hand, is I have been waiting for competition on the Pennsylvania side. So I'm looking for higher wage rates on Pennsylvania just because of the proximity to New York. It's possible that this group of people making less than $15 an hour is relatively immobile, so we won't see that. So it's just something that I'm sort of excited that somebody decided to study so we can make those plans going forward and give some advice to our growers in terms of where their pay scale needs to go. One of the things that I have noticed is that the minimum wage in New York is complicated, and it has been impacting growers in the sense that they don't necessarily understand what it is. So there's a perception by employees that the minimum wage in New York State is $15 an hour. And for a little while, I think employers had that same perception. And that's because for some people, sometimes, somewhere, it would be. And it's also because it was sold as a legislative success to transform the minimum wage right to $15 an hour, which is not exactly what happened. So I think if you're trying to understand what you need to pay for labor, both in terms of compliance with the law and in terms of recruiting. If you're having trouble recruiting labor, it is important to understand that in Western New York, in our region, that there are 2 minimum wage laws. And while ours continues to go up every year for farmers, we're at $11.10. We'll be going up to $11.80 and $12.50. And then will be adjusted for inflation thereafter, assuming that there are no adverse effects of raising it. Like I said, it's complicated. There's also a fast food minimum wage, which is, we don't need to get into the definition of what fast food is, but they'll be at $15 an hour within the next 18 months. And they're already a couple of dollars an hour higher than the regular minimum wage. So to the extent that there's overlap between people who are qualified to do fast food, qualified to do manual labor, or farm labor, or driving truck, I think everything under $20 an hour is all sort of interrelated, even if the people don't have the exact same qualifications. So we're continuing to see upward price pressure on wages other than minimum wage. It is just interesting to note we're only seeing that in New York. We're not seeing that in Pennsylvania. And like I said, the firms are not reacting. So we're continuing to hire just as many people as we would have otherwise so far. And I think that's about all I have for now. I do want to remind you that because of all these changes, especially for our New York growers, Cornell has been working diligently to put together educational materials, seminars, and workshops. So one of those resources is called a Labor Roadshow. And it's put on by the Ag Workforce Development staff at Cornell University. They're part of CALS, and the closest they come to our region will be in Batavia, New York. They'll be there November 18th, so you would be able to attend that and hopefully finish up harvest. So they'll be in November 18th at the Genesee Community College campus. We'll get you some more of that information via the crop update as a reminder, and we'll link you up here as well. So if you have any questions, please feel free to comment. Join us at the roadshow, and if you have any other questions, feel free to contact our offices. Thank you again for joining us.